There are people who return to Mass at Easter wanting to receive communion, and they shouldn't always do so, because one thing is wanting to draw near to Christ, and another is arriving in a state fit to receive Him. This doubt is not small. Every year it happens to a lot of people. Easter comes, they return to church. After a long time, they feel they want to start again, and they think the logical thing is to do everything completely, attend, pray, and receive communion. The desire may be sincere. The problem is that sincerity by itself does not settle the question. The Church does not first ask whether Easter moves you emotionally. It asks whether you are prepared to receive the Eucharist. And that is where many people get it wrong, not in bad faith, but because they mix two different things: returning to Mass and being ready to receive communion. So let's go to the center from the beginning. Yes, a Catholic can receive communion at Easter without having gone to confession beforehand, but only if they are not conscious of mortal sin. If they know they have committed a grave sin and have not confessed, the Church teaches that they should not receive communion yet, except for one very specific exception. That is the short answer. Now it has to be understood well, because this is not about putting up artificial obstacles or making the Christian life harsher. It is about taking seriously what communion is and what it means to receive it. The Eucharist is not a generic welcome gesture. It is not a way of saying, I come forward because today I feel like it. It is the sacrament of the body and blood of Christ. And precisely for that reason, the Church has always said that to receive it, you must be in a state of grace. That means something very concrete, not being conscious of mortal sin. Here the first important confusion appears. There are Catholics who think that to receive communion you have to go to confession practically every time, as if each communion required a prior confession. That is not so. The Church does not teach that. There are also those who think the opposite, that it is enough to want it, to feel devotion, or to have returned on a special date. That is not so either. The key is not in the extremes. The key is in a distinction that sustains this entire topic. Not every sin prevents communion in the same way. The Church distinguishes between venial sin and mortal sin, and that distinction is not a technicality. It completely changes the situation. Venial sin wounds the relationship with God, but it does not break it in the same way as mortal sin. Mortal sin does break that communion in a grave way. That is why, when a person is aware of having committed a mortal sin, the Church tells them something very precise. Before receiving the Eucharist, you must be reconciled sacramentally. This is not about feeling very sinful or feeling more or less worthy. If we reduced it to emotions, everything would become confused. There are days when someone may feel very unworthy and not be in mortal sin. The opposite can also happen. A person can feel at peace and, nonetheless, know perfectly well that they are carrying something grave unconfessed. That is why the criterion is not sentimental. The criterion is objective. If you are conscious of having committed a mortal sin, you must go to confession before receiving communion. And here it is worth stopping for a moment, because this sentence, properly understood, clarifies almost the whole video. It does not say, if you are imperfect, don't receive communion. It does not say, if you have ever sinned, don't come forward. It does not say, if it's been a long time since you confessed, you are automatically excluded. It says something more precise. If you know you have committed a grave sin and have not received absolution, you should not receive communion yet. That nuance changes everything, because many people at Easter return with a real desire to start over. And they think, I'll go to Mass, receive communion, and then I'll get myself in order. Or, God knows I want to come back. Or, since today is Easter, I'll go forward, and then I'll confess later. And here is the mistake. Easter does not suspend the need to be reconciled. It does not automatically make fit what previously was not. It does not replace confession. It does not put you in a state of grace simply because you have returned to the Church or because you have a nice intention. Easter is the announcement of new life in Christ. Precisely for that reason, it demands to be taken seriously. If a person returns to Mass at Easter knowing they need to confess, the best step they can take is not to skip that step. It is to take it. This is sometimes hard to accept because today an emotional idea of religion is imposed. If you feel it, do it. If it comes from within, go ahead. If it moves you inside, that's enough. But the Church does not work like that with the Eucharist. It never has. Because communion is not only a gesture of closeness, it is real communion with Christ. And for that reason, it cannot be received as if it were a generic symbol of inclusion. Here we come to what the Church says with notable clarity. Whoever is conscious of grave sin should not receive communion without first going to sacramental reconciliation, except for one very specific exception. That except exists, but it does not mean what many people imagine. Let's go to that exception, because there is usually a lot of confusion there. The exception is not, I feel awkward not receiving communion because everyone will look at me. Nor is it, since I came to Mass at Easter, it would be strange to stay in the pew. It is not, this time I'll make an exception and then I'll confess. It is not, since I really do love God, surely that's enough. The exception the Church considers requires two things at the same time: a grave reason and the real impossibility of confessing beforehand. In addition, it requires an act of perfect contrition and the firm intention to confess as soon as possible. That greatly narrows the field. The grave reason is not simple social discomfort. It is not embarrassment. It is not avoiding a scene. It is not the idea of taking advantage since I'm here. We are talking about extraordinary cases, not the normal situation of a Catholic who could confess and simply has not done so yet. And the real impossibility of confessing is not a small nuance either. It does not mean I haven't organized it yet. It means there truly is no reasonable opportunity to receive sacramental absolution beforehand. When it is understood well, the exception stops being a convenient backdoor. It is seen for what it is, a narrow exit for serious circumstances. This matters a lot to say because, in matters of conscience, people tend to manufacture shortcuts. And the most common shortcut here is turning an exception meant for grave cases into an unspoken pastoral habit. It should not happen. The rule remains very simple. If you are conscious of mortal sin, first be reconciled, then receive communion. And here, a very concrete scene appears that repeats far more than it seems. A person has spent months or years away from the sacraments. Maybe they have continued believing in their own way. Maybe they have not felt comfortable in the Church. Maybe they have lived quite on the margins. But Easter arrives and something moves inside. They decide to return. That is good, very good. They go into Mass. They hear the gospel. They see people go forward to receive communion. They feel they want to do the same. And inside themselves, two movements cross: the sincere desire to return and the uncomfortable awareness that perhaps something is still missing. That something is not a bureaucratic obstacle. It is confession. The easiest reaction in that moment is to think, God will understand. And yes, God understands. But precisely because He understands, He also calls for a concrete order. He does not ask you only for emotion. He asks you for conversion. He does not ask you only to come closer. He asks you to come back rightly. That changes the scene a lot, because then not confessing beforehand no longer seems like a minor detail. It becomes the central point of the return. And here I want to say something important for anyone in that situation. If you return at Easter and you know you need to confess, you are not being left out because you are not receiving communion yet. You are beginning to return seriously. That can hurt, of course. It can be difficult. It can create a strange mix of shame, frustration, and desire. But sometimes the most honest and most Catholic gesture a person can make at that Mass is precisely to stay in their place, make a spiritual communion, and decide, I'm going to confess as soon as possible and I'm going to come back rightly. That gesture, which from the outside may look like deprivation, can in fact be the first true act of inner obedience after a long time. Because not receiving communion one day does not mean moving away from Christ. This has to be said strongly, because many people experience it as if it were an expulsion. It is not. You can attend Mass. You can listen to the Word. You can pray. You can adore. You can make a spiritual communion. You can begin to reorder your life. You can leave that Easter with a decision far more serious than that of someone who receives communion out of inertia without examining their conscience. Sometimes, the most respectful thing toward the Eucharist and toward yourself is not to advance to the altar yet. Not because the altar is closed forever, not because Christ rejects you, not because you can't come back, but precisely because you can come back, and it is fitting to do it well. The Church does not establish this discipline to humiliate the sinner. It does so to protect two things at the same time: the seriousness of the Eucharist and the seriousness of reconciliation. If anyone could receive communion simply because they feel it in their heart, confession would be emptied of weight, and communion too. Everything would become diffuse. Everything would depend on mood. Everything would be immediate, but nothing would have form. The Church does exactly the opposite. It orders the path. First, you examine your conscience. If there is mortal sin, you go to confession. You receive absolution, and then you return to the Eucharist. That order does not cool faith. It protects it, and now it is worth going to the practical. What should someone do who finds themselves in exactly this situation? First, stop improvising. Do not solve this in the communion line or 5 minutes before Mass. Make a serious examination of conscience. Not theatrical, not obsessive, not scrupulous, serious. Look at your situation honestly. Second, distinguish whether there truly is mortal sin. It is not about calling everything grave out of fear, nor about downplaying what is grave out of convenience. It is about being sincere, and if necessary, seeking guidance. Third, it is very simple. If you know you need to confess, seek confession. Don't put it off anymore. Don't use Easter as a substitute for that step. Use it as the moment when you decide to take it for real. Fourth, attend Mass anyway. This is key. Don't make the twisted reasoning of, since I can't receive communion, then it's better not to go. That would be another mistake. Go, pray, listen, stay before God. The Church is not telling you to leave. It is telling you to take the next step in the right order. Fifth, make a spiritual communion if it applies. It does not replace sacramental communion, but it very truly expresses your desire to unite yourself to Christ and to prepare for that union fully. And sixth, after confession, return to the Eucharist in peace, without drama, without the feeling of having passed a test, simply reconciled, because that is the Catholic logic, not to improvise communion, but to arrive at it in a state of grace. And here it is worth closing with something very clear. The question of the video was not whether Easter is a beautiful moment to return. Yes, it is. Nor was it whether the Church wants to close the door to someone who comes back after a long time. It does not want to do that. The question was another: whether a Catholic can receive communion at Easter without having gone to confession beforehand. The complete answer is this: they can if they are not conscious of mortal sin. If they are, then they should not receive communion yet, except for a very specific and extraordinary exception. In that case, the most Easter-like thing is not always to approach the altar in that very moment. Sometimes, the most Easter-like thing is to be reconciled first and come back rightly. That does not diminish Easter. It takes it seriously, because the new life proclaimed by the resurrection does not replace conversion. It demands it. It's not only about approaching the altar, it's about approaching rightly. Tell me in the comments what you think about this topic, and subscribe to keep going deeper into the Catholic faith step by step.